Hi there everyone, welcome to another video. This is K.Ilistration from Puffing Fish Productions. Just thought I'd do a little bit of a tutorial to just kind of help out anyone who's using Photoshop and maybe wants to optimize their workspace a little bit and help Photoshop run a little better on your computer. These sorts of settings will work on a Mac, a PC, and Linux as well. So just follow along if any of this might be able to help you. So most of this is just going to be small little performance tweaks that we can do to Photoshop itself, and this will be able to work for a majority of Photoshop versions. This is the newest version at the time I record this, but it can be done with any prior versions, even if you have CS5 or CS6 or something older. Yeah, it shouldn't be a problem. So what we're just going to go into is we're going to go into our edit menu, which may be in a different spot on a Mac, but you want to go to your preferences. So we'll just start with our general preferences here where we can look at everything as a whole. So, generally there's not too much we have to do here. This is just if you kind of want to change some file type stuff, which you can do for changing legacy and transforming and stuff like that. I'm not worrying about that too much. Another thing I might recommend for anybody who was watching this has to do with things like the color appearance. Generally with performance, it can help to actually choose a darker theme. A darker theme can also be good because it's easier on the eyes. So even if you want to use like a darker one like this, it's perfectly fine. If you're someone who uses the lighter themes, it definitely looks quite bright. But if you want to use a darker theme, it's usually I think this one might be the default one actually, but it can be pretty good to help out the performance a little bit if you've got, a darker setting, for example, like we'll just do this just for the video. So you can change different things to be certain colors, but usually a darker theme can help with both your eyesight and the actual performance of the program as well. Then you can also do a little bit of stuff with the workspaces, but I'm quite happy with how it is. If you are not a fan of floating windows, you can kind of uncheck this and that can help too. Again, there's also options with the tools, so if you want to change some of the commands and stuff like that, but that's mostly just a usability thing. Okay. We can go check the settings, so for things like camera raw and stuff like that, if you deal with compression, you can have a look at the compression, because storing too much of that on your hard drive can inevitably slow down the hard drive and cause different sorts of performance issues, but I think it's usually okay. And just a fun fact for anybody in chat, if you find that your Photoshop regularly crashes, it's very important to have some kind of recovery saving option, which you can set. So if you want it to be every 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever, it's worth having this turned on if you just want to make sure that you have backups or it crashes or anything like that. So it's worth having a look at that. If you want to save things like image previews, if you find that you need help with your performance, it's probably worth to not save image previews, because having to render those image previews on your computer can also add a little bit more to performance usage, but also having to save them means that it affects the file type a little bit too. So it can be beneficial to not save the image previews if you find that you want to save space and make it easier to run on your computer. Next thing to kind of look at is, again, your export settings. If you're fine with these, sometimes messing with those can help. And then the actual performance settings we're looking at here, which is probably the bulk of what I'm going to be suggesting. So you can kind of move the slider along for how much RAM usage you want to dedicate to the program. This can be done with other programs like Adobe and the like, but you can kind of modify it to if you want to dedicate more RAM to the rendering and stuff like that. You can also go check your graphics processor settings. So depending if you have, if it is defaulting to embedded graphics or an actual GPU, like for example, my NVIDIA one here. So you can choose graphics processor. Alternatively, you can look up the actual settings and go through a bit more stuff if you have the need to. But for the most part, if it doesn't default to your correct graphics card, you can actually look at that information here. Another thing to do is actually, depending on how many history states you have, if you put a lower amount of history states, that can also greatly help with the performance of Photoshop. So if you change it to something lower, like maybe say 100, that's more than sufficient for most people who are just editing in Photoshop. So you can just work with that. You can also change your cache levels. So usually 2 is like probably the optimum amount to have if you have if you want to just save space. You can set it to 1, but you probably don't need to. If you set it to higher, you'll probably be using a lot more performance and stuff like that. But again, it's kind of something you can tweak if you find that you're having trouble with your caching. The other thing you can do is for your cache tiles. If you make the cache tiles smaller, again, as it mentions here, it changes the cache levels, which can also help with performance. So most of this is probably other type of cache you can look at, but that's kind of the bulk of the majority of what you can do to kind of improve your performance. You can also look at things like scratch disks. If scratch disk setup, it can help with saving files and again with caching and stuff like that. So usually it's recommended to have either a spare hard drive or even an SSD or something. If you don't have a scratch disk, that is fine. It's not a huge requirement, but having one can help with your performance. So if you have a computer with an SSD, even just using the SSD, Photoshop will load a lot better. If you're using it on a regular hard drive, having a spare hard drive or having a partition that works as a scratch disk can be very helpful. You can also mess around with your cursors a little bit, kind of like mine actually, but that's a different story. You can kind of mess with this a little bit. So if you want to make it a smaller one, or if you want to change the leash color and stuff like that, so changing to a different brush tip can also help. All right, so the next thing we can look at is probably just your VRAM. So if you do a little bit of 3D type work in Photoshop, there's not too much of it in Photoshop generally, but if you actually work with 3D styled files in Photoshop, it's worth looking at the 3D tab here and checking your VRAM allocation. So if you have like a decent, if you have like a large GPU that has VRAM, then it's kind of worth doing this. If you have an embedded graphics, you probably won't have much VRAM to begin with, and it's just best to leave it on something default or maybe something lower, like 20 or 30%. But if you have at least a gig of VRAM or more, then you can kind of mess around with this slider a little bit to add more or less VRAM dedicated to the 3D software. If you don't work with 3D at all, you could probably turn this all the way down and just never use it. That's fine. Even things like your shadow quality you could modify if you find that you need to have it lower for certain reasons. So it's just another thing you can kind of look at. All right, and that's basically everything to cover in today's tutorial of Photoshop. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope this helps somebody. If you have any other questions, feel free to comment below, and also check out the description if you'd like to see anything else that I do, whether it be art videos or even the stuff on my other channel. Thanks again so much, and I'll see you next time.